I have held dying men in my arms. I have pulled brothers from water so cold it steals the breath before the mind can even form a prayer. I have done things in the name of this country that I will carry to my grave without a word of complaint, because I still believe, that freedom is worth the cost of the man who guards it. But I want to tell you something that took me 61 years and a dirt road in Montana to understand. I gave everything I had to my country. I gave it my youth and my body and my silence and my sleep. What I did not give, what I failed to give, was myself to the people who needed me at home. And that failure, that one quiet failure that never made any headline or any citation, was the heaviest thing I ever carried. Heavier than any mission, heavier than any loss. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm a retired United States Navy SEAL, and this is the story of the worst thing I ever did, and the strangest, most unexpected grace that came from it. I left Pine Hollow, Montana when I was 19 years old, and I told myself I was going to serve something larger than a small town on the edge of nowhere. That was true, but the other truth, the one I didn't say out loud, was that I was afraid. Afraid of staying, afraid of needing people and being needed back. The military gave me a clean reason to go, and I took it with both hands, and I never looked back. Not when my mother got sick, not when my father's hands stopped working and he had to sell the north pasture, and not, God forgive me, not when my younger sister Mara called me 3 times in the last year of her life, and I let every one of those calls go to voicemail because I told myself I was too deep in something classified to talk. Mara was a school teacher in Pine Hollow her whole life. She was the kind of woman who remembered every child's name and stayed late when a student was struggling, and drove elderly neighbors to doctor's appointments without ever mentioning it to anyone. She was the best person I ever knew. She died on a Tuesday in February, and I found out 4 days later from a county letter. I did not cry at first. I sat in a parking lot in Billings and I stared at the dashboard of my truck for a long time, and I felt the specific, terrible weight of a door that is closed forever. Then I drove. I drove for 2 days without a destination because that was the only thing I knew how to do with pain that had no battlefield. 10 years passed. I am not proud of that. 10 years of motel rooms and long-haul stretches of highway and a kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's just empty. I had been married once to a woman named Carol who loved me more patiently than I deserved, and cancer took her 7 years before this story begins. And after Carol, I stopped allowing myself to want anything that could be taken away. That is the mathematics of a broken man. You stop wanting, so you stop losing. But what you don't realize, what took me until that snowstorm to understand, is that you also stop living. Then one morning I woke up in a motel outside Billings to a letter from the county stating that the property taxes on Morris Farm on Pine Hollow Road had gone unpaid for 4 years and the property was approaching foreclosure. Something moved in me. Not nostalgia. Not grief exactly. Something older and quieter than both. I folded the letter, I packed my single bag, and I drove west into the mountains through a snowstorm that turned the whole world white and still. The smoke stopped me. I came up the long gravel drive and I saw it before I saw anything else. A thin gray column rising from the chimney of the old farmhouse, curling up into the pale winter sky like a question the house was asking the clouds. I stopped the truck. My hands tightened on the wheel the way they do when the situation ahead is unclear and potentially hostile, and every trained instinct I had said, assess before you move. I sat there and I looked. The barn had a new section of roof, fresh timber, not weathered. The fence along the south pasture had been repaired recently, and on the front porch step, the one Mara had painted blue 20 years ago, still blue, still there, sat a pair of small children's boots, neat, side by side, like someone had taught a child that the world goes better when you take care of your things. and from somewhere inside that house came the sound of a woman's voice, low and soft, singing a melody that reached through the windshield and the cold and the 10 years and grabbed me somewhere beneath the sternum. It was the lullaby my mother used to sing, the one Mara had memorized as a little girl and carried with her everywhere she went. I sat in that truck for a long time before I trusted my legs enough to get out. Her name was Sarah Reed. She opened the door before I finished knocking. She had heard the truck, I think, and had been deciding. And she stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands and dark eyes that had seen more than a woman her age should have had to see. She was 32. She did not flinch when she saw me. She looked at me the way people who have survived real danger look at uncertain situations, steady, measuring, ready. Behind her in the kitchen doorway stood her son, Noah, 11 years old, arms crossed, jaw set, watching me with the careful eyes of a child who learned early that strangers sometimes mean the end of safety. I told Sarah who I was. I told her the property was mine. She nodded slowly, without drama, and asked me if I wanted coffee. I said yes. I don't fully know why. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the lullaby. I followed her into that kitchen, and the plan I had made, clear the property, pay the taxes, sell, leave, began to come apart before I even sat down. Because the kitchen was Mara's kitchen, exactly as I remembered it, but warmer. The school photos still on the wall, the Christmas ornaments on a small pine branch in the corner, the handwritten recipe cards in Mara's looping cursive still tucked in the wooden holder beside the stove. Sarah was making coffee in the same old percolator my mistress had used since before I left for basic training. I sat down at that table, and I felt something I had not felt in 10 years. I felt like I was somewhere. Sarah told me everything quietly, without asking for sympathy. She had come to Pine Hollow 18 months ago with her children and nothing else, running from a man who had spent years teaching her that love and fear were the same thing.
She found the farm dark and the front door unlocked. Mara had never locked it, not once, and she knocked for 20 minutes before going inside just to get the children warm. She meant to stay one night, but the furnace worked, the pantry had canned goods, and Noah slept through the night for the first time in 2 years. She found work cleaning motel rooms at night and kept the heat running and the pipes from freezing through that first brutal winter. Then spring came. An old man appeared at the barn one morning and started fixing the roof without asking anyone's permission. Walter Green, 71 years old, former mechanic, lost everything he had saved in 40 years to a hospital bill that arrived 6 weeks after his wife's funeral, which is the kind of cruelty that doesn't make the news, but hollows a man out completely. Walter didn't talk much. He fixed things. He repaired whatever was broken, because as he told me once in the barn on a quiet afternoon, and I will never forget this, he said, "Daniel, I can't fix what happened to Margaret, but I can fix this fence, and some days that's enough to keep a man standing." I had to turn away when he said that. I looked at the wall and I breathed, and I did not let him see what those words did to me. There were also 2 little girls, Emily and June, 8 years old, twins, placed with Sarah after their relatives had stopped answering calls. Emily talked constantly, filling every silence with words the way children do when silence has been dangerous. June barely spoke. She watched everything with large, careful eyes and processed the world in a way that was quieter and perhaps deeper than most adults I have known. About 3 weeks after I arrived, I came back to the farmhouse one evening to find a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. I opened it standing there in the cold. It was a drawing, crayon, careful lines, of a house with smoke coming from the chimney and 5 stick figures standing in front of it, and a 6th one, larger, standing a little apart from the group. Underneath, in a child's unsteady handwriting, were 2 words, "Don't go." I stood there in the cold and the failing light, and I read those 2 words until my vision blurred. I folded the paper very carefully and put it in my chest pocket, close. I knew without asking that it was June, the quiet one, the one who watched. She had seen something in me that I had not yet admitted to myself.
I was learning in those weeks who Mara truly was, and that knowledge was a wound that kept reopening. People in Pine Hollow told me things in the quiet, careful way that people share stories about someone they're still grieving. She had paid electric bills for struggling families without telling them how the money arrived. She had driven people to chemotherapy appointments twice a week for years, sitting in waiting rooms with books and thermoses of coffee, never once complaining. She had sheltered women and children in the farmhouse before Sarah, quietly, saying nothing to anyone. My sister had lived her entire life in service of the people around her, the exact way I had been trained to believe a life of service should look, except she had done it without a uniform, without a citation, without anyone ever calling her a hero. And I had spent the last years of her life too proud and too broken and too far away to answer her calls. I sat in the barn alone one night with that understanding, and I let it hit me the way it deserved to hit me. I did not try to manage it. I just sat with it. Sometimes the most honest thing a man can do is stop running from the weight of what he got wrong. It was a Thursday night in late December when the back door slammed and Sarah appeared on the porch with controlled fear on her face. The particular fear of a mother who is counting heads and coming up short. Noah was gone. He had overheard the adults that week talking about the foreclosure, about the taxes, about the possibility of losing the farm come spring, and he had drawn the conclusion that a child who has spent his whole life being a burden draws in those moments, that if he removed himself from the equation, things might get easier for everyone. I did not think, I moved. I went out into that Montana darkness with a flashlight and 40 years of training, and one thing driving me that had nothing to do with training. I was not going to let that boy disappear into the cold because the adults in his life had failed to make him feel essential. I found him 40 minutes later beneath the old railroad trestle at the edge of town, crouched small against the frozen concrete, his breath coming in pale clouds, his thin jacket pulled tight around his knees. He was not crying, he was past crying. He was just enduring, the way children do when they have run completely out of options and are simply waiting to see what comes. I sat down beside him on the frozen ground. I took off my coat and put it around his shoulders without a word. We sat in the dark for a long time before he spoke. He said that people always leave when things get hard. He said he thought if he left first, it might hurt less for everyone. And I want you to understand something. I have sat with dying men. I have done things in service of this country that I will never fully speak of. But those words from that 11-year-old boy, in the dark, in the Montana cold, broke something open in me that 22 years of military service had never touched. Because they were my words. They were the exact philosophy I had lived by for 40 years, and hearing them from him was like looking into a mirror held up by someone who had no idea they were doing it.
I put my arm around his shoulders. I told him I had lived the same way for most of my life. I told him it was the loneliest way a man could exist. I told him that his mother had walked through fire to keep him safe, and that nothing about their situation made him a burden. He was the reason she kept standing. And then I told him the thing I had never said to anyone. I told him I had a sister who called me and I didn't answer. I told him I told myself it was easier that way, for both of us. I told him I was wrong in a way I cannot go back and repair. He listened to all of it without moving. Then he stood up quietly and handed me my coat back, and we walked home together through the snow and the silence, and it was the most real conversation I have ever had in my life. Some truths only come out in the dark,
Some healings only begin at the bottom of things. After that night, I stopped planning to leave. I contacted a tax attorney and paid what was owed. I filed the paperwork to secure Sarah's tenancy legally. Walter and I rebuilt the barn workshop together over 2 months and opened it to anyone in Pine Hollow who needed to fix something, a motor, a chair, a bicycle, whatever was broken. The town was small and cold and struggling, but it was not finished. I had been wrong about that. I had confused quiet with dead and stillness with surrender. Spring came the way it always does in Montana, slowly and then all at once. The snow pulling back from the dark earth and the first green pushing up through the mud like something that refused to stop believing. The children played in the yard. Walter repaired the south fence with the patience of a man who understood that good work takes exactly as long as it takes. Sarah laughed one afternoon, a real laugh, open and unguarded, and the sound of it carried all the way across the yard to where I was standing at the mailbox at the end of the drive. I reached in and took out the mail, a bill, a seed catalog, and one envelope, handwritten, addressed to the Brooks family, Pine Hollow Road, Montana. I stood at the end of that drive and I read it twice. It was from an old neighbor of Mara's, welcoming the family, thanking us for keeping the lights on in the old place. But what I felt standing there had nothing to do with the words on the page. What I felt was the specific, extraordinary grace of being included, of being named, of belonging to something after years of belonging to nothing. I had given this country my youth. I had given it my body and my silence and my best years. And the country had given me purpose and brotherhood and something worth protecting. But home, the thing I had run from at 19 and spent 40 years without, home was not waiting in some place I had earned or deserved. It was here. It had been built by a woman who cleaned motel rooms at night, and a boy who was too brave for his age, and an old man who fixed broken things, and 2 little girls, one loud, one quiet, who left drawings under windshield wipers. It was built by my sister, Mara, who had loved this place and these kinds of people her whole life, and had left me the only inheritance that ever truly mattered. Not the land, the example. I stayed.
For the first time in my life, I stayed. And I want to tell you, whoever you are tonight, whatever you have left behind, whatever door you have been afraid to walk back through, it is never too late to stay. It is never too late to be found, and it is never too late to become, quietly and without fanfare, the person that someone who loved you always believed you could be. If this story found you tonight, if it touched something you haven't let yourself feel in a long time, please subscribe to the 11th Hour Last Words. Every week we share stories like this one, stories of ordinary people who carried extraordinary weight. Stories for anyone who has ever loved, lost, and found their way back. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell. These stories are made for you. They have always been made for you. This story holds deep value for older American audiences on multiple levels. It honestly portrays the emotional cost of military service, not the glory, but the disconnection, the grief, the difficulty of returning to ordinary life after extraordinary sacrifice. It gives dignity and visibility to the homeless and displaced, showing that people without homes are not without worth, without love, or without the capacity to build something beautiful. It honors quiet community heroism through Mara Brooks, reminding viewers that the most powerful lives are often the ones no monument was ever built for. It shows children as emotional anchors rather than burdens through Noah and June, in ways that older viewers who raise children and grandchildren will recognize and feel deeply. And at its heart, it is a story about redemption, the specifically American belief that no matter how far a man has wandered, no matter what he has left behind, there is always a road back to something worth belonging to. For viewers who have lived long enough to know the weight of regret and the miracle of second chances, this story holds up a quiet light and says, "You are not too late."
You never were.